Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. We're going to be talking about Spencer Stuart's 2021 annual S&P 500 Board Index, something that we do on an annual basis on the show. And joining me again to have this discussion is Julie Daum, who's the North American Board Practice Leader for Spencer Stuart. Welcome back, Julie.
Thank you, TK.
Spencer Stuart has been conducting this board index now of the S&P 500 for 36 years. And I'm not insinuating that you have been here for all of those years, but it is accurate that you've been here for many of those years.
That's true.
Had the privilege of reporting out, both observing and reporting out the results for many of those years. So knowing you have all this history with this index, what in this year's results sort of has made an impression on you?
Well, I think probably as everyone is expecting me to say what I am going to say. This was the year of diversity. In the past 2 years, we've talked about gender diversity, which was a big focus in the boardroom. This year, that changed. And in the wake of the racial justice reckoning that we saw, boards prioritize the recruitment of directors from historically underrepresented groups. As a result, this class of new directors is the most diverse that we've ever seen. A record-breaking almost half, 47% of new directors in the S&P 500 are from underrepresented groups, and 43% are women. And if you combine those two, because some of the underrepresented groups are members are women, but if you combine that, the groups account, women and underrepresented minorities account for 72% of the new directors this year. That's up from 59% last year and what would have been 30% 10 years ago. Women reached a milestone this year. 30% of all of S&P 500 board members are women. That's the most we've ever seen. But there was a slight decline this year in the percentage of the new class that were women. Another big change this year is that boards have begun to disclose who is on their board, not their names, but disclose information about who is on their board and about the ethnic and racial composition. So 28% of boards this year gave specific director details about, who is a diverse director. All boards talked about their diversity, generically, but many of them were very specific. 32 boards included LGBTQ in their disclosure, and 5 of them actually named the directors. So that's a big change, to actually get very specific in the proxy. 39% of boards said they would have or will adopt some sort of Rooney Rule by committing to including women and people from underrepresented groups on all board searches in the pool of candidates.
Yeah, just so in case somebody doesn't know what the Rooney Rule is, it means that in the course of doing interviews, there will be candidates that fit that
right.
ethnic and racial groups, at least in the interview,
and women.
In the interview
exactly.
process.
Right. It doesn't mean you have to take somebody, but it means you have to consider a broader candidate.
Yeah, and that Rooney comes from the NFL situation. So
I'm from Pittsburgh, so it's from the owner of the Steelers.
Yes, it is. So let's dig down a little further into the ethnic and racial groups. When I saw the highlights, I did see that there was some nice growth in the Black African American segment. So talk a little bit about what you've seen specifically in that group.
That is true. Nearly all of the gains in diversity from this new class are directors who are Black or African American. 1/3 of all new independent directors are in that group, which is three times more than last year, and the most we've ever seen. So that was a big uptick. The Asian directors, they are 7% this year. They were 8% last year. And Hispanic, Latino directors make up 7% of the new class, which is up from 3% last year. But the real story was the number of Black directors who entered the boardroom this year.
So it's nice to see that there was some growth, because in the Hispanic Latina category, because I think they were at 3 or 4% last year, which, knowing they are the largest ethnic group in the U.S., it's just been their representation has been dismal.
And I would say it's still, if you look now, the percentage of directors who are Black is 11% versus 13% of the population. The biggest disparity is between the Hispanic, Latinx representation. They are 5% of all directors, and they're 18% of the population. So there was a real increase and kind of leveling for Black population, but not in the Latinx Hispanic population. So you're right, that is still a big disparity.
Well, and what's equally disappointing, when California passed its mandates, you would think that in the state of California, you would have seen some uptick, and there the representation has been equally poor, and even with the mandate. So I know that the Latino Corporate Directors Group is working, 24/7, on working. It seems like they're doing a good job, but that's probably the biggest disparity, as you said, that we see, and that'll be interesting to see how that whole category changes in the coming year.
I think that's right. I think that is right. I think we should be proud of the progress that was made for the Black community, but it has lagged for the others.
Yeah. So one of the things that the board index lets me do is to talk about the board progress over the last decade. And honestly, for me, and I would probably be safe in saying this for you, the numbers don't exemplify the change that we've seen in the corporate boardroom or with the directors, over these last 10 years. I mean, if you go back 10 years, it's been pretty phenomenal, the change that has happened. And there's a couple good things that let me just point out. I'd be curious to hear your comments on that. So here's a decade ago numbers with today. So female board representation, you talked about this. From 10 years ago, it was 16%. Today, it's 30%. Splitting the CEO chairman role, which is often discussed, was 40% a decade ago and 59% today. Now, that's a little confusing because you have to look at the independent chairperson.
Exactly.
Okay. And 10 years ago, that was 21%. And today, it's had a nice growth to 37%. And then the last statistic I want to give is individual director evaluations, which everybody knows I've always been on my soapbox. I think that that's the right way to go. 10 years ago, 34% of companies did individual board evaluations. Today, that number has grown to 47%. So when you see that change, and again, I don't think the numbers tell the whole story, but what's your observation when you see the kind of growth in those categories, particularly being pushed by shareholder groups?
Well, I think you just hit on a really important point. I think everything you just talked about has been pushed by the independent investors, right? Institutional investors, sorry. So they have been proponents of getting more women on boards, getting more diversity, for having split leadership. And they also, interestingly, have been a big proponent of director evaluations. They do not come down on having term limits or retirement ages. They think that boards need to evaluate directors and determine who should stay, and who's been whose skill set or maybe experience is dated and should leave. And I think that everybody recognizes the importance of having the right people around a boardroom table in a time where there's so much change going on in terms of technology and customers and global issues, ESG issues. It's the world is changing, and so it's important to have the right people around the table. And yet turnover remains very small. So this year we saw more new directors come in. So maybe about 9% of board seats turned over versus about 8% usually. But what really happened this year is that many boards, in order to bring in diversity, they increased the size of their board. So instead of having a director leave, they went up a director. And the same thing happened last year, bringing women in. Instead of replacing a departing director, they added to the board size. So turnover, we don't know what's going to happen, but most boards feel like they're at the right size. So if they've gone up one or two directors in order to bring in diversity, does that mean that when the next director on that board comes up to their retirement age, the board will go back in size and won't replace them? So we had an uptick in new directors this year, but I'm not positive that we aren't going to see a decline in some of the years coming up, because basically boards don't have term limits, and they use retirement age for their methodology of getting turnover. And of the directors, that of the boards who use retirement age, it is 75 plus for most of them. So that, and the average age of U.S. of these board members is 62 or so. So that shows you that there is a long runway for a lot of directors on U.S. boards if they're going to stay till they hit 75. So this is a big, this is a big issue that, it seems like we had more new people come in this year, but it wasn't necessarily that we had people leave the boardroom. We had additional people come in.
So, Julie, I'm glad you mentioned the issue of expanding your board, because that is not something that's difficult to do. Okay. And it sort of helps say, I don't have to wait until somebody leaves. I can expand the board. And if I want to pull it back then to my original number, I can do that. So that shouldn't be a hurdle when somebody says, I can't expand my, I don't have any openings. Okay. On that. So
right.
I'm not sure that that's a great excuse. And the other thing is, to the point of the institutional investors, it is amazing how topics become the focus of the board when the institutional shareholders vote against the director. Okay. Voting against directors does get people's attention on the board. So
yes,
we've both seen that certainly happen. So, Julie, we have about a minute left. Is there anything else that you want to mention about the index that sort of made an impression on you?
Well, I think the increase in boards who say that they do board evaluations, I think, is a really good thing, and I think that that is something we want to see more and more of. It's still less than half of boards that do it, but I think that's been a positive. And again, going back to our point before, that's the result, I think, of institutional investors saying we want to see other mechanisms for turnover. And I think we've seen different kinds of people come in the room. CEOs are now no longer serving on boards, or not very many of them. And we've seen, younger people come in. We've seen a lot of people without board experience. We've seen people with different kinds of backgrounds entering, an interest in people that don't necessarily all come from that CEO rank. So it's been there's been an expansion of the definition of what makes a good director. And it doesn't have to be a CEO. And I think that that's been important. And I think also kind of youth and also people who are active. So instead of a push for more people who are retired, a real push for people who are working and going to stay working in the world in which we are all competing and living.
Yeah. So I'm always happy to see the percentage of people that do board evaluations. What I'm not happy about is when I see in research the number of people that think that there's directors that should be replaced. Or worse than that, there is some statistics that people do not feel that they can be frank during a board evaluation. And that really is, torpedoes any value that you're going to get out of an evaluation if people don't feel that they can be frank. So anyway, I think everything continues to make slow steps forward. The index certainly helps us do that. So where can people get we only touched the surface. Where can people see a whole copy of the survey results?
So you can see it at spencerstewart.com/U as in United, S as in Sam, B as in board, I as in index. And you'll also see, if you're interested, we this year and last did a breakdown of our board index by industry, and that will be available also. So if you're a bank board and you want to see what other bank boards are doing, you can look at the cut that way.
Yeah. Well, Julie, it's always a pleasure to have you. Again, I always enjoy it. So we'll look forward to, again, the updates from Spencer Stuart along the way with some of your other research. And I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having me.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.